Hop, where are you?
Right here.
I promised you we would do this.
Well, we're not done.
Well, we're not done. It's just the beginning. Only the beginning. I'm in a singing mood tonight for some reason. Well, welcome everyone to Commodore Barry Palooza. This is actually the first Read the Revolution evening for the 2023-2024 season. I actually feel like yesterday we were all here concluding the spring lecture series, so it's exciting to bring you back. Of course, these are wonderful conversations with authors, chance to interact with some great scholars doing wonderful work about the American Revolution. And one of the exciting things that happened during the COVID era was us expanding into not just having live audiences here, but live streaming to people around the country. So there's like 100 people tuned in from all coasts, from the Canadian border to the Gulf Coast, and we welcome all of you. Please use that chat function to tell us where you're tuning in from. If during Tim's remarks this evening there are any questions that you'd like to ask, we're going to have a little bit of like a fireside chat moment here at the end, and we'll try to get some of those questions in to those of you who are tuning in remotely. So tonight, of course, our good friend of the museum, author, avid sailor, Tim McGrath, is presenting a talk, What Think You of an American Fleet? The Rise and Fall of the Continental Navy, which draws on two of his award-winning books, Give Me a Fast Ship, The Continental Navy and America's Revolution at Sea, and John Barry, An American Hero in the Age of Sail. And we're really going to focus on the life of our local hero here, John Barry. If you've ever been to Independence Hall and you've seen that handsome fellow standing on a pedestal, that is John Barry. And he actually grew up in a house directly across the street from where I live, about a 10-minute walk from here. So I think about the Barry family a lot, not just because Hop keeps reminding me that he's really important. Now, for those of you who are here tonight, you've had an opportunity to see some featured artifacts. This is an inducement for those of you who are tuning in within commuting distance, but you did not want to sort of put your shoes on and drive into the city tonight. We pull some objects out of the collection that are relevant for the evening's lecture. In many cases, things that are in our collection that actually have never been displayed publicly, including all the things that you see on display here. You can read about them there on the screen if you are so inclined. And it's a good chance to just remind those of you, particularly those of you who are members, and I'd love to just stop for a second. How many of you are visiting the museum for the first time tonight in person? This is good. So you're all close. Francine, you are not visiting for the first time tonight. For those of you who are members, we have our Collections Society, which is like an expansion pack on membership in the museum. And this is a group of people who are interested in having closer encounters with curators, with the collection, helping us through their donations to Collections Society to actually add to the collection, to steward our collection. And we do special visits. We do visits with private collectors. We do some great events here in the museum. And that allows us to continue to build the collection with wonderful material like that which you see here. Speaking of really cool material, you see that sword in the upper part of the picture there? And do you recognize President John F. Kennedy? And do you see that sword hanging behind him in the Kennedy White House? This is Commodore Barry's sword, his original sword he used during the Revolutionary War. Of course, this was particularly meaningful to President Kennedy as a Navy veteran of World War II and as the first Irish Catholic president of the United States. He really connected with this history of Commodore Barry. The sword, which descended in the Barry family until 1939 and then was sold at auction, has not been back to Philadelphia since 1939, and it is on display this year courtesy of the Kennedy Presidential Library in our core exhibition. So as if you needed any other reason to come to Philadelphia and visit the museum, that's it. Now, we have been talking about the war at sea, the Continental Navy, the history of privateering, since the museum opened. The proof is you could not have brought that ship in after the museum was built, right? So that was literally parts of that ship were lowered through the roof as we were building the museum here in 2016, 2017. And one of the characters that is in this display since we've opened. And I should mention, by the way, the ship was built by our friends just down the street at the Independent Seaport Museum, which is a great partner organization. And in their boat shop, they actually built all the components of the ship, brought it in and assembled it for us here. But one of those characters, you actually see him on the left-hand side in the wall here, is a man named James Fortin, who was, of course, born in this neighborhood about a block from where we're sitting here at the museum in 1766, 10 years before the Declaration of Independence. He went to sea as a 14-year-old, leaving just from about where Independent Seaport is located today. By age 15, he was not just a combat veteran, but was actually a prisoner of war and had an amazing story of his life. He survived, just to let you know, and had an amazing life. And we're exploring that story of James Fortin and 3 generations of his family through our special exhibition, Black Founders, the Fortin family of Philadelphia. Now, you literally have like 2 weeks to see this exhibition, and it is everything we do is excellent here. This is like the best thing we've ever done. Can I have a round of applause for Black Founders? The story of the Fortin family of Philadelphia opens with hearing a 9-year-old James Fortin hearing the words of the Declaration read at Independence Square, the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence, his wartime service, his life as a prisoner of war, him becoming a business owner, a philanthropist, 3 generations of his family who struggled to hold the nation up to the promise of the Declaration of Independence, of liberty and equality and the welfare of ordinary people. So it's an amazing story. We have brought objects in from as far as the United Kingdom, from the National Archives in the United Kingdom, objects that have descended in the Fortin family that have never been displayed in public before. It's all here, but you got to get here by November 26th to see it in person. So have I made my point? Now, as if it couldn't get any better, as sad as we are to be closing Black Founders, on February 17th in the same space in the Patriots Gallery here at the Museum of the American Revolution, our next special exhibition, Witness to Revolution, The Unlikely Travels of George Washington's Tent. Now, because virtually all of you have visited the museum before, and many of you probably online have visited the museum, you have been transported by the magic of our Washington War Tent presentation, that 12-minute film that takes you on a journey from the Revolutionary War through all of the generations, all of the kinds of people who have carried that tent forward. And we use it, of course, as a kind of metaphor for the fragile American Republic. Well, imagine that film is the intro film for a 5,000 square foot exhibition. And that's exactly what's going to open in February here. We're going to tell that story through art, through objects. We have amazing pieces that are being brought back. Our friends at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home in Virginia, loaning us the field bed that General Washington slept in the tent, is going to be here in Philadelphia. Martha Washington's traveling trunk that she used as she traveled for 6 months each year, all through the 8 years of the Revolutionary War, to be with her husband in winter quarters. These are objects that have not been in the presence of one another, not have been back with the tent since 1802. I can't believe they let me have this job. It's so cool. And that story will carry through, and all of the kinds of people. You're going to come for George Washington. You're going to learn about William Lee, his enslaved valet, and about the generations of his family that were responsible for passing that tent down and preserving it. And the story that's left out of the tent film, because we only had 12 minutes, is the story of the Marquis de Lafayette. Because next year, 2024, is the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's return on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the American Revolution. And in October of 1824, Lafayette processed right down Chestnut Street, behind where I'm standing here, past Independence Hall. There was a dinner at the Chestnut Street Theater attended by 4,000 Philadelphians. Frank Johnson, the legendary African-American band leader's band played, and then Lafayette got on a ship and chugged down the Delaware River, down the Delaware Bay, and up the Chesapeake Bay, and he landed a couple days later at Fort McHenry. And there were two national treasures on display that day. Flying from the flagpole, the Star-Spangled Banner. As he gets up to the Fort McHenry, the militia are drawn up, and they break their ranks to reveal, not unlike the way we reveal the tent in the theater, by the way, George Washington's tent, the tent that's 20 feet below where I'm standing right now. And under that tent is a group of men who had served as officers in the Continental Army. They were Lafayette's comrades in arms, and Charles Carroll, who would be at this point was one of three surviving signers of the Declaration of Independence. And those men had a reunion under that canvas, and there was not a dry eye under that tent or for anyone around that tent. And that night, John Quincy Adams, who was about to be elected president, who as a 9-year-old boy had climbed up on the roof of his house with his mother Abigail to listen to the far-off sounds of the Battle of Bunker Hill, gave a toast, tears of glory, gratitude, and joy under the tent of Washington. So that is all bottled up and going to just explode downstairs when you all come back in February for Witness to Revolution. So can you tell I'm a little excited? There it is. So I'm going to kind of land on the title slide here. I've mentioned Tim McGrath, who is a good friend of the museum, literally the nicest human being I have ever met in my entire life, other than his wife Sid. He's the recipient of the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval Literature and a 2-time winner of the Commodore John Barry Award for Maritime Literature, which honored his book, John Barry, An American Hero in the Age of Sail, and Give Me a Fast Ship, Continental Navy and America's Revolution at Sea, which was published in 2014. His latest book is called James Monroe, A Life, again, another Revolutionary War veteran, and he's currently abandoning us for a book about Gettysburg, 4 days at Gettysburg. Boo, yeah, I know. It'll be a good book, I guarantee it, which is going to explore decisions made by President Lincoln, by General Robert E. Lee, connected to the tent, by the way, and Major General George Meade, sort of during the Battle of Gettysburg and after, and the consequences of that. McGrath serves on the board of the Port Wardens at the Independent Seaport Museum, again, just down the street from where we're sitting, and previously served as a board member at Fort Mifflin, which is the fantastic Revolutionary era fort that was built so close to the airport at Philadelphia Airport that if you're approaching from the north and you're about to land and you look out the left side of the plane, you look down and you go, that fort's awfully close to the airport. So anyway, so without further ado, where are you, Tim? There, I can't see that far, but anyway, let's welcome Tim McGrath.
Thank you, buddy. Wow. I feel like following Scott is like being a cap gun going off after a 21-gun salute. Thank all of you very much for coming, and a special thanks to Scott and to Hannah and to Matt and Alex and Ryan for taking care of the audiovisual here. Today's November 15th, and 246 years ago, does anybody know what happened? It was the last day that the Americans withstood the bombardment at Fort Mifflin, and they left their flag flying and snuck out at night to fight another day. And thanks to Scott's comments, the young captain who was wounded at Fort Mifflin, Samuel Smith, survived. And in the War of 1812 and 1814, right after Washington was burned, the Marylanders and Secretary of War James Monroe made sure he was in charge of the defenses of Baltimore and arming and defending Fort McHenry. So everything comes around in our country. And I also want to thank my Seaport Museum friends and fellow board member Peter Ernst. I did my best to keep Scott busy up here. Did you guys get the tent in the car? Remember, it's a canvas, a sail from John Barry's frigate. We'll be fine. I want to take a little bit more time and maybe embarrass three people who are here, one of whom is one of the greatest history professors in the country and certainly in my lifetime, a very gracious man who knows more history than I think the rest of us combined. He read every word of the last three books, and he's still talking to me. I'm currently working on a project dealing with Cornwallis. Greg Irwin, would you stand up and be recognized? Two seats away from him is the closest we have to a direct descendant to Commodore Barry, a descendant of his nephew Patrick Hayes. The Hepburn family has been nothing but kind to me over the last 20 years, and my wife, with dinners, with suggestions, coming up with artifacts. And in following Commodore Barry's military tradition, Austin's daughter, Annie, is a West Point lieutenant on assignment. Austin, your turn. And last but not least, my in-house editor, who every 4 pages before we send it to the agent and the editor has written across it, land the plane. She is the queen of the house and the queen of my heart. Sid, would you stand? All right, let's get down to business. There's Fort Mifflin, I was supposed to point out. The first time I was called on to speak on behalf of an Irish-American naval hero was over 60 years ago in the fall of 1960. Our 4th grade teacher, Mother Mary Rachel, decided that there would be a presidential debate followed by an election. My friend Fred, who was not only the smartest kid in the room, but the smartest kid in the world, would stand in for Vice President Nixon. To my immense delight, I was selected to speak for Senator John F. Kennedy, and I did have a hairline back then. With the untrammeled zeal of a 9-year-old, I plunged into my part. It wasn't enough to rehash the senator's phrase, "Let's get the country moving again." I needed to communicate fully about the recent recession, the missile gap with the Soviets, winning the space race, and the importance of the islands of Quemoy and Matsu. I was pumped, so pumped, in fact, that when a 6th grade girl told me that Nixon wants to send American kids to school on Saturdays if he's elected, I dismissed it as hogwash and restudied Quemoy and Matsu. And by debate day, I was ready. But so was Fred, who I'm sure taught Bill Gates everything he knows. The recession could only be worsened, he remarked, by the Democratic Party's love of something called deficit spending. There was no missile gap. The space race would be won by our German rocket scientists and not the German scientists the Russians got. And it was paramount to realize the implications of Quemoy and Matsu by their longitudes and latitudes and their proximity to Red China. Fred knew their longitudes and latitudes. Before an audience of 30 Roman Catholic children, Fred's Protestant Nixon was thrashing my Kennedy. Finally, Mother Rachel gave us each 30 seconds to sum up. Quoting Churchill, Fred reminded the class that a democracy like America's is poor government, but much better than a communist one. All I could reply to such wisdom was, if Mr. Nixon is elected, we will all go to school on Saturdays. When Mother Rachel asked where I obtained that information, I said from someone a lot older and smarter than myself, Kennedy won in a walk. I promise tonight's remarks are rooted in far more accurate documentation. The Continental Navy's story is not just about ships, and it is not just about dates and battles. It is a story about politicians, visionary shipbuilders, sailors, officers, some very brave, many with tragic ends, and a few buffoons. It's about wives and lovers, and like all narratives from the first part of our collective story, it's about enslaved Americans. And while we can't tell all of this remarkable but rarely told saga tonight, I'd like to share with you what I learned about these extraordinary men and women. By the 1770s, the economy of Britain's American colonies was so dependent on the maritime that every man's business, be he a fur trader, furniture maker, factory owner, plantation squire, or an employee, indentured servant, or enslaved person, the food one put on the table was in a large part due to the maritime. The Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and the bodies of water that cloak Western Europe were the major highways of business. So when the colonies began openly defying the British government over taxes on goods, levies on shipping, and stamps on everything, it was very common to find sailors among the protesting crowds. In 1773, while the Indians of the Boston Tea Party included silversmith Paul Revere, physicians, lawyers, merchants, and shopkeepers, there were quite a few sailors among them, although it was a blacksmith's apprentice, Joshua Wyeth, whose descendants would include 3 generations of distinguished American artists, that had the best line about the affair, chuckling about making so large a cup of tea for the fishes. Flash forward to April 21st, 1775. John Barry, the top captain for the most successful merchant team in Philadelphia, Willing and Morris, was coming up the Delaware aboard the finest jet-built ship in America, the Black Prince, returning from her maiden voyage to England. Meanwhile, at the City Tavern, just a block away, the St. George's Society for the Assistance of Englishmen in Distress. We don't have clubs with such catchy names like that anymore. We're having their annual St. George's Day feast upstairs. Robert Morris was preparing to toast the health of King George III when a courier burst in with news of Lexington and Concord. While others spilled their glasses and upended chairs in their rush to spread the news, Morris alone raised his glass, toasted the American cause, and stepped out into the uncertain future. The next day, under what Barry noted in his log as fine, clear sunshine weather, the Black Prince, seen here, nestled against the Willing and Morris dock in a scene of total pandemonium. One onlooker described it as a river covered with ships and the wharves covered with inhabitants. The waterfront was clogged with wagons full of goods. Merchants whose ships were at sea, didn't own any, pleaded with their colleagues to give them space in the holds for their goods. Stevedores and dockhands jostled each other into the water, going up and down the gangplanks. Cargo was not loaded, it was tossed. The merchants were at the forefront of resistance to Crown policy, declaring they would fight for their rights. Now, upon learning that their fellow colonists in Massachusetts had done just that, they hoped for just one more killing in the marketplace before the real killing came up the Delaware. Even Barry's ship was returned to sea without properly being refitted. The idea of an American Navy began with Congress in general and John Adams in particular. Outside of successfully defending several Yankee sailors for slaying a Royal Navy officer whose press gang was physically attempting to add their names to the Royal Navy muster rolls, Adams had no maritime experience at all. In fact, he had only been out to sea once in his life, a 15-mile fishing trip to Cohasset Rock off Massachusetts. But Adams had left his wife Abigail and their children at their Braintree farm outside of Boston, where they could see the bombardment and attack of Bunker and Breed's Hills, and he was receiving regular reports of the dangers around Boston, not from the Boston papers, but from the mother of his children, how when a British man of war anchored nearby, it occurred an alarm, as she put it, in this town, and we were up all night. When Adams queried to a colleague, "What think you of an American fleet?" he was not really asking. From May to October of 1775, he argued for such a force. The first battle of the Continental Navy was fought in a room in what is now Independence Hall, 40 feet 40 inches long and 38 feet 6 inches wide, about 1/3 the length of a frigate and slightly wider than her beam. Adams' most vociferous foe was the imposing Marylander Samuel Chase, a lawyer with a vicious tongue, and he relished using it. As an American Navy for him was the maddest idea in the world. While both men enlisted allies among their colleagues, the British helped Adams' cause just by being the British. Their Navy began shelling New England towns, while the ousted Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, used a British frigate in his home in exile, organizing both a loyalist fleet of privateers and declaring freedom for all enslaved men of patriotic owners if they would join his Ethiopian regiment, an Emancipation Proclamation predating Lincoln's by 68 years. By October, even Chase saw the Navy as a necessity, and on the 13th, the Continental Navy was born. While Congress purchased merchantmen to convert into warships, including the Black Prince, and Adams drafted articles of war for the new Navy's officers and sailors, Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island cherry-picked 4 of the first 5 captains out of his family and New England contacts, including his brother Isaac, who became the first and only commander-in-chief of an American Navy. Commodore Hopkins would face the Royal Navy, the finest war machine yet created by man. King George's captains, including Andrew Snape Haymond, later knighted for his services during the war. So, here's our guy, and here's their guy. Who do you want to bet on? John Adams called his serving as midwife to the new naval force the pleasantest part of my labors in Congress. But it was a colleague of his, Ben Franklin, who took full advantage of this new force once he arrived in Paris. Seasick throughout the entire crossing, Franklin was specifically ordered that once he arrived in France, he was to let old England know and see how they like to have an active enemy at their door. For most of the war, Franklin did just that, handing out commissions to American mariners and giving orders to cruise the British coastline, capture or destroy British shipping, driving up insurance rates, and spreading a level of fear along the British coast not seen since the Spanish Armada. Congress appropriated $870,000 to build 13 frigates with construction assignments given from Portsmouth to Baltimore. The amount was woefully short. When an epidemic of inflation set in 3 years later, Congress found itself appropriating $1 million just to refit and repair one frigate. The frigates were designed by shipwrights like Philadelphia's Joshua Humphreys, a Quaker who was disowned by the Friends for his military efforts, but came up with handsome designs and innovative methods of construction. Once at sea, the frigates were beautiful to behold, and the envy of European experts who watched them approach their harbors. Most of the sailors for the First Fleet were from the Philadelphia area. Able seamen were offered a whopping $8 a month to sign the muster rolls. Landsmen received much less. Even today, few jobs are more dangerous than being a sailor, but in the 18th century, a sailor's day was similar to that of a modern-day fireman. Hours of boredom punctuated by death-defying acts of courage necessary to survive. Living before the mast and the forecastle, a sailor was exposed to the elements during his watch, and then sent below to rest in a crowded area reeking of bilge water, livestock, smoke, and unwashed shipmates. Now he was introduced to a new hazard, battle. In an effort to stand against the expertly trained gunners of the British Navy, Continental officers drilled their sailors incessantly at their guns. The goal was to match that of a British gun crew and complete the 11-step process of firing a cannon in under 2 minutes. But because they lacked gunpowder and shot, the Americans had to shadow box, literally pantomiming their moves until the last round, when they might actually fire a cannonball. Tun Tavern in Philadelphia gave birth to the Marine Corps. The second in command of the Marines, being recruited for the new Navy, was Robert Mullen, whose mother Peggy ran the Tun Tavern. The family of the commander of the Marines, Captain Samuel Nicholas, owned the Conestoga Tavern in Philadelphia. Coincidence? You Marines in the audience can judge, but these men distinguished themselves in battle after battle, and it was a Marine, the Scotsman William Hamilton, tenuously crossing the foot ropes with a basket of grenades above the Bonhomme Richard in the Serapis, who turned the tide of battle for John Paul Jones. Many Continental sailors were experienced tars, but quite a few landsmen joined out of patriotism or for the adventures of it. As we mentioned, they certainly did not join for the money. Congress, thinking themselves smart enough to believe sailors an ignorant lot, boasted that they offered larger percentages of pay and prize shares than the Royal Navy did. What they didn't tell their sailors was that those shares went into effect after Congress claimed 50% of the proceeds of the sale of captured prizes and goods, while the King's Navy sailors got their shares based on 100% of the money. Sailors might not have been as educated as politicians, but they knew how to add, and they saw who was subtracting. Throughout the war, Congress bemoaned that privateers, armed merchantmen given letters of marque allowing them to seize British ships and keep the money from all sales, took the lion's share of available sailors who quickly saw they would make better money by not serving in the Navy. Many congressmen invested in privateers themselves. I guess the term conflict of interest hadn't been coined yet. In one letter, Robert Morris bewailed privateering in one paragraph, while in the next to mention that he was investing in a privateer. It's estimated that black sailors comprised as much as 10% of the Navy's muster rolls throughout the war. Quite a few were enslaved. One, bought by John Barry before a cruise, fought in an early battle. Barry was no sooner ashore when the man was resold. The gentleman, whose name is unknown to history, appealed to the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety for the money he believed he had earned in combat. He was not looking to buy new slops or spend it in taverns or brothels. What he wanted to purchase was his freedom. After fighting against the British with the same degree of courage as the rest of the crew that displayed, would the committee intervene on his behalf? They could not, and they would not. Countless enslaved men, including those owned by congressmen, saw action at sea on Continental ships. All of them saw their wages and prize shares go to their masters. Many of them jumped ship, and once their vessel reached port, their captains called their act desertion. The owners called it running off. These men called it freedom. One African American who personified both devotion to duty and true resilience was James Fortin, who Scott just spoke so eloquently about, a free black teenager who signed on a privateer to provide an income for his widowed mother. His ship was captured by a British frigate, whose captain, upon learning that James could read, took him under his wing while James tutored the officer's son. When the ship reached New York, young Fortin was offered the choice of serving in the Royal Navy, returning to England with the captain's family, or be transferred with the other prisoners to the prison ship Jersey on the East River of New York, the Andersonville of the Revolution. Fortin chose the Jersey. He survived the war and returned to a mariner's life, inventing a new system of rigging that was used throughout the age of sail, and becoming a prominent Philadelphia merchant and abolitionist. And those of you who haven't seen the exhibit downstairs, I join Scott in urging you to come back. It's remarkable. Over 1 year after the Navy's birth, the shortage of manpower grew so pressing that captains signed on Army cast-offs, invalids, jailbirds, and even British prisoners, often using them as Marines. Many a Continental captain ordered his officers to keep a weather eye out for treachery, and frequently they found it. The Navy's muster rolls often included foreigners as well: Frenchmen, Scandinavians, and the closest foreigners, as far as Congress was concerned, Native Americans. One of them, on Barry's voyage, learned of a plot aboard ship by British hands to kill the crew, the captain, and all officers save one, and him to navigate them home. This gentleman's telling Barry of the plan saved many lives and resulted in the ringleaders being flogged mercilessly while hanging by their thumbs until they named for Barry their accomplices. Other foreign-born hands included two shipmates on John Paul Jones's most famous ship, Bonhomme Richard. John Jordan, listed on the muster rolls as hailing from West Bengal, which is actually East India, and a 12-year-old cabin boy from Naples, Giuseppe Braccialeria, whose name the officers shortened to Joseph Brussels, an act of Americanizing a foreign name 100 years before Ellis Island made that a habit. In the Battle of Flamborough Head, Jones's great victory that incurred the highest percentage of casualties of any fight in the war on land or sea, both these sailors lost a limb, Jordan a leg, Brussels an arm. Despite the risks of battle and the elements, and their rarely being paid by Congress, Continental sailors showed courage, endurance, and humor. In the late days of 1777, Tim, the frigate Randolph, under Nicholas Biddle from Philadelphia, sailed into Charleston Harbor after a three-day cruise and netted 3 prizes. The cheers were barely out of the throats of South Carolinians when Biddle's men were surprisingly paid their shares. Their subsequent celebration became the stuff of legend. Dressed in the latest finery, they were seen at all hours along the Charleston waterfront, newspapers reporting their escorting females ridiculously ornamented with jewelry for services rendered we will only imagine. One man bought a horse and tack, only to prove that as an equestrian he was a hell of a sailor. Later authorities found him dead drunk, carrying his saddle and bridle. Slurring his words, he explained that he had lost his ship but saved his rigging. The Continental Navy's list of captains includes few well-known names, but each one possessed his own unique approach to management and personality quirks. They were all skilled mariners, and all were brave at least once or twice, but many consistently. We only have time to shine a lantern on 4 of them, and 3 are from Philadelphia. There was young Nicholas Biddle, who served in the Royal Navy before the war and went on an expedition towards the North Pole with Horatio Nelson as a shipmate. Biddle's courage was as second nature to him as breathing. "I fear nothing but what I ought to fear," he matter-of-factly wrote to his brother. A dashing, handsome ladies' man with an uncanny sense of when and whom to fight, he would have likely eclipsed Jones and Barry for exploits, but for one tragic split second. John Paul Jones. The Bantam Scotsman was a peerless mariner. He saved one frigate from sinking in a brutal storm by cutting off her masts and anchoring her to keep from foundering. He was a true visionary, writing page after page on how to improve the Navy's ships, ordnance, and organization. He was his own press agent, even writing poetry and publishing it about his deeds. Jones' initial successes against the British in the Western Hemisphere were breathtaking, but he is better known for Flamborough Head and his earlier raid of Whitehaven in Scotland to burn British ships in port. He actually burned only one, and an attempt to kidnap a Scottish laird to exchange for American prisoners, only to find his crew of kidnappers cowed by the absent laird's very pregnant wife. All they came back with was a teapot. Nevertheless, both unsuccessful acts created panic up and down the British coast and went a long way towards increasing anti-war sentiment in Britain. And there was Gustavus Cunningham, an Irish-born Philadelphian captain who captured or burned more British ships than Jones and Barry combined, cruising British waters, commanding a small cutter, a fast ship favored by smugglers but half the size of a frigate and terrorizing the British Isles. Of all the American rebels, it was Cunningham whom King George wanted the most to hang, and he almost got his wish. Cunningham carried out his actions while France was still neutral, forcing King Louis XVI's government to publicly rail against the man England called the Dunkirk pirate, while all the while happy to see him wreak emotional and financial havoc on their ancient enemy. Cunningham did more to bring France into the war than anyone, with the possible exception of Benjamin Franklin. His daring attacks all around the British Isles are forgotten now, but you are looking at the real Errol Flynn. If there's one captain who was a sailor's captain among the lot, it was John Barry, who still had to face down one mutiny by British prisoners, one by unpaid American sailors, and a last unofficial one by his unpaid officers. But on the whole, his men liked and respected him very much. One officer wrote how the innocent mirth of the sailors was his delight, and good humor would extend to permit himself to be the subject of joke and mirth. When anyone had neglected or done anything wrong, and when asked by Captain Barry how he came to neglect it, the person would begin to state he thought so-and-so. Captain Barry would hastily say, "Who gave you the right to think?" which accustomed the crews to address their comrades, "Who gave you the right to think? Don't you know that Captain Barry thinks for us all?" On one instance, he overheard a sailor say the line and let a long silence send the speaker into quiet fear before breaking into laughter himself. His adventures in the Revolution read like a Patrick O'Brian novel. His first command to Lexington won the first American victory over a British ship, the sloop Edward. In late June 1776, while Jefferson was here writing the Declaration of Independence, Barry and another intrepid captain, Lambert Weeks, sent their men by longboat to Turtle Gut Inlet in what is now the lake area of Wildwood Crest, for those of you South Jersey vacationers like myself, to unload barrels of gunpowder off a merchantman under fire from two British warships. On January 3rd of 77, Barry and his sailors fought with the Continental Army in Washington's victory at Princeton. During the Valley Forge winter, after Barry lost his frigate Effingham in an incident with Congressman Francis Hopkinson, shown here, in a scene that reads like a colonial version of Caddyshack, Barry took two barges with muffled oars past occupied Philadelphia in the dead of night, slipping past the docked British squadron and the posted sentries. He then embarked on a cattle rustling expedition with General Anthony Wayne, seen here, before capturing two transports and a schooner, part of a convoy coming up the Delaware. The next day at Port Penn, as a nor'easter howled and the British warships began firing on his small captures, Barry dashed off a note to Washington at Valley Forge, telling him of what had occurred, and enclosing with them a captured cheese and a jar of pickled oysters, which Barry hoped would crave Washington's acceptance. He was given command of the Alliance, the finest American-built frigate of the war, with a history of bad luck. but under his command, the Alliance had 2 successful prize-taking cruises and 2 memorable battles at sea, one against 2 British men of war that began just when the wind died. The enemy ships, having sweeps, could row into position on either side of her unprotected stern while the Alliance lay helpless. After 2 hours of fighting, Barry took a shot of grape in the shoulder and was carried below, where, an hour later, his timid second-in-command approached him, asking leave to surrender. The second battle was fought off the coast of Cape Canaveral against the British frigate Sybil, a battle in which Barry outthought, outsailed, and outfought his opponent, 2 months after the Treaty of Paris had been signed ending the Revolutionary War. With these exploits, it is small wonder that 11 years later, President Washington asked Barry to be his first captain of the United States Navy and work with him on how and where to build it. And there were the women who loved these men. Nicholas Biddle flirted shamelessly from Nova Scotia to Philadelphia until Elizabeth Baker, the daughter of a Charleston plantation owner, won his heart. Before his final voyage, Biddle redrafted his will while making plans to marry her upon his return. And Elizabeth did get married 19 years after Biddle's tragic end. John Paul Jones was quite a ladies' man, literally having at least one girl in every port. Jones was once smitten with the young African-born poetess Phyllis Wheatley of Boston, and even wrote a poem to her. John Barry's second wife, the beautiful Sarah Austin, not only dealt with her husband's absences, but the consequences of a family rent in two by the war. Some call the Revolution our first Civil War, and the Austins prove it. Sarah was a stitch sister of Betsy Ross. One of her flags flew atop Jones's ship, the Ranger. But while her brother Samuel marched with Barry and other Philadelphians and sailors to fight with Washington at Trenton and Princeton, her older brother William was such a staunch loyalist that he was given responsibility by General William Howe after the fall of Philadelphia to see that the departing patriots didn't burn the city down. Excuse me. When the British left Philadelphia, William went with them, not into exile, but as a mate on one British ship and later commanding a 20-gun Loyalist privateer. He never saw Philadelphia again. It fell to young Sarah, now caring for her half-sister's 8 children after the woman died in childbirth, to fight for the return of the Austin estate, which included the Arch Street Ferry, which basically was the SEPTA of Philadelphia at that time, and had been seized by the Pennsylvania Assembly. It's important to note that William did this because that's what he believed in. And while his sister and his brother really had nothing more to do with him, he struck up quite a correspondence with Commodore Barry after the war. There's a delightful letter in the New York Historical Society where Barry has written to William and called him my dear brother and asked him if he could send him the latest books, including Tom Jones, and to make sure he gave them to the captain so he didn't have to pay any duties on them. When Gustavus Cunningham was captured by the British off New York, he was sent to England to hang, weighted down with 55 pounds of chains. Congress and Franklin wrote letters protesting his treatment, but he was spared the noose only after Washington promised the British that 6 captured Royal Navy officers would meet the same fate. Instead, Cunningham was sent to Mill Prison in Plymouth, certain that her beloved Gusty would be killed. His 24-year-old wife, the remarkable Anne Hockley Cunningham, gave her children to relatives and crossed the Atlantic in a Philadelphia packet. If life aboard ship was difficult for sailors, just imagine what Anne went through. Seasick, unable to cross the deck except on a sailor's arm, her nausea returning again and again while she tried to sleep on a pitching sea. Once in France, Anne informed Ben Franklin that she would stay until reunited with her husband. That is devotion and a special courage we can only admire. With peacetime came a horrific recession. Depression is a more accurate word. And the sailors and officers cheered in the streets and sung about in taverns, now haunted the waterfronts, desperate for any kind of work. Moved by their plight, a penniless John Barry borrowed $200 from a bank to buy their shares at a reduced rate just to give them money to feed their families. When the bank called in the loan, Barry asked his friend Anthony Wayne if he could borrow the money from him. Wayne didn't have any money either. Partisan politics began playing a part with these appeals, even if the petitioners had no political affiliations whatsoever. It only mattered who or what side presented the petition. When 3 survivors of Flamborough Head, amputees Joseph Brussels, John Jordan, and another James Mackenzie, appealed to Congress for disability pensions, Congress did not deliberate so much as bicker. Since this memorial was sponsored by Robert Morris, a sizable block of congressmen opposed it merely because Morris supported it. Finally, the imposing Jordan hobbled into Independence Hall in crutches, appealing to Congress's sense of decency. Even with such a stirring appearance, their petition was only passed by 3 votes. Oh, and Congress finally appropriated funds to pay off Jones's sailors from the Bonhomme Richard in 1848. Doesn't all this sound familiar? As the soldiers, sailors, Marines, and their families of the American Revolution set the bar for devotion to duty and sacrifice for succeeding generations of Americans, so too did Congress and the public set the example of support the troops as long as no taxes are levied for the best weapons, decent wages, or the care of their widows and orphans. Throughout the 8 years of the Revolution, the Continental Navy had 57 ships, but by war's end, there were only 2. John Adams, as optimistic of the Navy he created at war's onset, now wrote at war's end, "It is very difficult to think of our Navy without tears." Yet only 15 years later, he became the first president to see the new United States Navy at action in the quasi-war with France. Wouldn't it be lovely if John Adams and Abigail, one of the first Americans to argue passionately for gender and race equality, if they could see what we have seen and read regarding our Navy? What think you of an American fleet? What would they think of an American fleet sent to sea by James Monroe and subsequent presidents to capture slave ships and free their captives, while Congress kicked the issue of slavery down the road? What would they think of an American fleet torn in 2 by the Civil War, who first sent ironclads into battle at Hampton Roads, thereby making every other navy in the world obsolete? What would they think of an American fleet led by the USS Olympia just down the street from here, the oldest steel ship still afloat, that went from Victory at Manila Bay, transported the unknown soldiers' remains from France to Arlington, and whose muster rolls include a former officer of Admiral Farragut, Commodore Dewey, and Franklin Van Valkenburg, who became the captain of the USS Arizona? What would the Adamses think of Americans at sea during World War II, including my uncle Jack Coyle, a medic and chief petty officer in the Merchant Marine, family friend Bob Starr, who lied about his age to join the Coast Guard and then become a Navy aviator, C.B. coxswain Carmen Bucci, who, semi-conscious in his last days on Earth, repeated the phrase, "We'll get off this island," as he returned in his sleep to the Pacific, or Corman Ellis Shields, who left his foxhole on the Admiralty Islands to tend the many wounded on the beach, was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his gallantry, and was my mother's first husband. What would the Adams think of a U.S. Navy that was the first line of defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy and Admiral George Anderson used the Navy in the same judicious manner that Washington and Barry first discussed in the spring of 1794, and while John Barry's sword paid silent witness to the decisions that the Kennedys made. Or of the stellar accomplishments of naval aviators Alan Shepard, Marine Corps aviator John Glenn, and naval aviator Neil Armstrong, who with their comrades in space orbited first Earth and then the Moon before walking on it. And what would the Adams think, especially Abigail, of an American fleet that has performed countless humanitarian missions around the world for generations, and whose example of leadership in this century include Admiral Michelle Howard, best known as the commanding officer during the rescue of Captain Richard Phillips of the Maersk, Alabama, or of Admiral Michael Mullen, who set an example to America by ending discrimination on all military fronts. John Adams was right. What think you of an American fleet indeed? Thank you very much.
I told you it was going to be good. Comfortable seats.
These are really nice.
Don't fall asleep. I'm celebrating the approach of duck season with my socks.
That's duck season?
Well, and pheasants on my tie, so you can...
Wabbit season.
Howdy, Tim.
I'm good, and yourself?
I'm good.
I have to disclose to you guys, this is the first time I've had an interview with a museum executive who was also in a nude scene in a movie.
You have either said too much or too little.
It's up to you now.
I want to hear your version.
My version is, we came here, we've done a couple of articles on the Inquirer about the building of the museum, and that's where I met the wonderful Alex McKechnie. Where's Alex? Okay.
Director of Communications at the museum.
Yes. And so while we were talking, we got into a conversation about how inaccurate some movies are about history. And I talked about this movie, some of you might have seen it in the 80s, Alan Alda written, produced, and directed and starred, called Sweet Liberty, where it basically took a character based on Bannister Tarleton as the hero and an American young lady that had an affair with him. And it's a funny movie. It's got the most 80s soundtrack you ever heard. You're waiting to hear it today. President Reagan did. But as we were talking about that, a beaming Mr. Stevenson said, I was in that movie. I was in the nude scene. And Alex's jaw dropped. And then I found out that it's in print on DVD and sent her it. And she did see the nude scene. She couldn't make out Scott, but...
It was a crowd nude scene, so...
You spoil everything.
It was tasteful nudity, I assure you. But I was right next to Alan Alda, which is pretty cool. All right, we've given you all time to actually think of some questions, so...
We're happy to take questions from the audience. I just want to make sure I get the microphone to you first.
Good evening. Great presentation. I really appreciated it. There's been a lot of debate over the title Father of the American Navy. Some say John Paul Jones, John Barry, John Adams. In your esteemed opinion, who do you consider the father of the American Navy?
All of them. No, I think you've got, there's also George Washington, since he actually rented ships during his time in New England. But I think it focuses on, you could make a good argument for all three. I mean, John Paul Jones was, as we said, probably his own PR agent, and he really was quite a visionary. John Adams, as we said, was the driving force that we even got a Navy. But I have to be an Irish American, and through the research and everything else, And also, doesn't hurt that Austin's sitting in the second row. But I would vote for Barry for two reasons. One is that he served in both the Continental and the United States Navy, and that Washington thought enough of him. He's captain number one on the list. But the other thing that people don't know too much about that I found fascinating is that while he's serving in the quasi-war with France, he's already been pretty beat up by a lifetime issue apparently with asthma. It's what killed him. But he used his frigate, which was aptly named the United States, and it was launched just a few blocks from here. And it is a sister ship of the Constitution. When you're on the Constitution, you're also on the United States. And while he didn't have the heroics that Richard Dale had, and where the first Secretary of the Navy is saying to John Adams, Barry is old and infirm, he made a share of captures. But what he did do was he turned the frigate United States into our first naval academy. The people who were on his ship include Richard Summers and the most famous of them all, Stephen Decatur, whose father, ironically, was the captain of the privateer that was captured with James Fortin aboard. But I think Barry really, his example is such, and it's interesting to me, I even think these guys are buried where they belong. Jones has the burial center of his dream below the chapel at Annapolis. The Dolphins have the catafalque there, the swords there that he had that was given to Barry, and then Barry gave it to Richard Dale. But he's buried by himself. And if you walk over to St. Mary's, Barry is buried with his wives and and friends, and it's just people had such a hand in his life. And ironically, as we talk about with President Kennedy, there's some Bouviers who are buried there as you walk up towards his grave. But I got to go with Barry.
That was a great question and terrific answer. I would like to.
We're still friends?
I would like to follow up on that question and give Tim an opportunity to say, use his imagination. And we do know that John Barry and John Paul Jones were both friends and respected each other. And suppose these two chairs had John Barry and John Paul Jones, say 200 and some years ago, sitting, maybe having a drink, and if this gentleman were to ask the question, which of you captains is the real father of the American Navy? How would each of those men respond?
If I was John Paul Jones now, because I'm shorter than Scott, I think Jones might have gone, oh, I think me. I don't know. I think they would probably skirt that one, Austin. I don't think they'd get into it too, because while they only met a couple times, and you know this story, they actually had a breakfast together while Barry was recovering from his wound, and Jones was on his way up to oversee the only ship of the line built by the United States, the America. In fact, for a while, Barry was put in charge of that. And they have this breakfast, and we know about it because of Jones's letter. And apparently he told Barry he designed a cockade, and in the letter he says, here's the cockade I designed. And then there was a movement by the top captain on the captain's list, a fellow named James Nicholson, who Benjamin Franklin and a couple other people called the captain snug in his harbor, because he rarely went out to fight, and when he did, he got beat. But he had approached Barry saying, this was after Flamborough Head. Oh, Jones is trying to be an admiral, and he's ranked 17th, and you're 7th, and I'm 1st, so it should certainly be among the first 16. And Barry never said a word about that during this breakfast. But Jones learned about it, and Jones learned that Barry knew about it, and in the letter he says, I understand you know that something's been going on with this and you didn't mention it to me, and that's a sign of your class and your friendship. So I think they'd have probably, Jones might have brought it up. The Navy, the early historical center at the Navy Yard in Kidder Breeze these great guys. They're like Keebler elves. They can't wait to tell you something about what to know. But they call Barry Silent John, and they're not big fans of John Paul Jones. But you can tell the way they say Silent John, it's not an offhand remark, it's said very affectionately. So I'll take a pass. I don't think that they would have gotten into, a fight over that. If they got into a fight, Barry would kill them. But,
Well, can I take a stab at it?
yeah.
Well, my imagination says that, yes, the first part of your answer is true. John Paul Jones would have said, yeah, of course I am. And John Barry would have laughed and said, I agree with him.
Yeah. Could be.
We're going to take one more from the room and then one online, and we'll go to Scott.
When you see the Navy come here to Philadelphia and celebrate Commodore Barry, they are very boisterous and very out front to recognize Commodore John Barry as the founder of the American Navy. So I think that gives credence to that question, and that takes it out of your lap.
Very good.
I'm going to give our last question to our friends online. We have some descendants of different folks in the room, and one of them who's descended from the Marblehead Regiment was interested to know more about boatmen and informally trained sailors early in the war and how the Continental Navy leveraged those existing skills.
Can you run that by me again?
Sure. A descendant of the Marblehead Regiment is interested in how boatmen and people with sailing experience were used by the Navy early in the war.
Oh, okay. Well, they certainly were put to very good use. In the Continental Navy, a lot of the folks from Marblehead, served with a couple of the captains up there. Hector McNeil is one of them. And obviously, they had a hand in with Washington. And the boatmen, especially those that were brought into the Army by John Glover, who's a hero in his own right, they saved Washington's army in New York, getting them from Brooklyn over to Manhattan and up to Harlem. And they did it again just 30 miles north of us at Washington Crossing. Those guys were phenomenal. And if you've ever seen the boats that they crossed in crossing the Delaware, they're not these nicely seen, they almost look flimsy, the great painting by Lutz. But these were used to taking iron ore and coal down the river for trading. So they weren't the most comfortable boats, and they weren't very easy to man either. They were very difficult, and you've got a nor'easter going on and everything else. I mean, what they did was remarkable. Is that the answer you think they're looking for?
I hope so. And as is our tradition, we're going to hand the final question to Scott Stevenson this evening. And there will be a book signing, an opportunity to talk more. I know many folks in the room will have further exciting questions, but go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, so Tim, welcome to the Museum of the American Revolution, which I know you know well since we've opened.
Well, you can welcome me anywhere, anytime, Scott.
I've been thinking, one of the things that strikes me about all your books, I mean, it is, whether they're biographies or sort of great stories told through biography, it's a rare talent to be able to sort of tap the humanity and to bring these people to life in a way that you really feel like you know them, and you capture that so well. I mean, you're a David McCullough level of writer here for sure.
Wow.
I really mean that.
That's the closest I'm going to ever get to being compared to Sandy Koufax. That's pretty good. I will. Do I have time?
Well, I did. So, but the question is, the museum here. We're trying to engage, particularly rising generations, to sort of understand the relevance of history and see themselves as part of that stream of history. And we do it through uncovering and sharing stories about people, primarily through biography. And we're approaching America's 250th here, right? 2026. We hope all of you tuning in from the audience are going to be here to celebrate this. And I'm just curious your thoughts about, what are your hopes for America's quarter millennium birthday, and what the work that the sort of shared work that we do can, as we look at all the challenges we're facing politically, at home, internationally, how can we? I told you I'd ask you an easy question right at the end that you can answer very quickly.
If any of you have jobs, you should go get ready for them tomorrow now. That's a great question. Hopeful, I think, in a word. It's funny. Philadelphia had more newspapers than London did in this era. So that sort of gives you a hint to America's appetite for news, and especially political news, but absolutely nothing like what we've seen in this century. We didn't talk about James Monroe, but there's somebody who might be a good example for this. When he was younger in politics, this guy was more of a Jeffersonian than Jefferson, and was this rabid partisan. If he was alive today, depending on his politics, because things have changed, he'd have been on Fox one night and MSNBC the next. And yet, by the time he's become Secretary of State, he really starts growing up and thinking outside of the agrarian box, because we're fighting a war, and then culminating in this coming month's the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine. So he really came to it. And as crazy as things sound, especially the news yesterday when the only thing we were missing was Bully Brooks and a cane, I think if there's one thing we've learned, it's that the people are more often better than their government is, and yet at the same time, I think it's true that you get the government you deserve, that it's also a reflection of where we are right now. We're watching families being torn apart by politics, and that didn't happen in the old days, being 72 when I grew up. If you had somebody that was way off on one side, on the left or the right, you thought, well, that's who they are, like they use Crest instead of Ipana or something like that. But I'll leave you with this. 3 Christmases ago, when my wife was at Penn for a couple months and was running a couple of errands and driving down Baltimore Pike, and somebody, you don't see them as much anymore, but they made a little bit of a comeback. The baby on board signs that were, and one person had one, and the lady's SUV had a blowout and veered off. 3 cars, mine and 2 others, pulled off to run and see. And when I was leaving and got back, I said, nobody said, who did you just vote for? Nobody asked that question. Nobody thought that. If the person had said, oh, I'm a Trump supporter, well, I'm not helping you, or I voted for Biden, well, you're nuts. They just went to help. And I think, I'll tell you what really is a good example of that is here, this place, our museum. Because if you remember here, and you've set it up like that, and Mike, and everybody, Hannah, Alex, Ryan, Matt, this is our museum, because it's our history is sort of like our collective bedtime story. And it does bother me personally that there are efforts to not allow that to happen. Don't you want to know? You want to know about James Fortin, and he was just a forethought. Working on this research with Gettysburg, I didn't know that there were African Americans that came to the battlefield to bury the soldiers among all the, and I'm thinking, where can I get, the African American Museum of the Civil War, and what documents do you have that we can use for this? Because that's part of the story as much as Lee or Meade or anybody like that. And I think we're getting better at that. I'm just hopeful. I think we will come together. I was here, my wife and I stood outside it. Thank you. I'm not done yet, though. That's my wife's, let's just land the plane. But we were at the celebration on the 4th of July. We were at the crowd at front of Independence Hall. I was there 14 years earlier to hear President Kennedy speak. And I think that a place like this draws us in. And the fact that our museum, when you leave the exhibits, who's a descendant of this museum? You have the mirror, you have the pictures. You know, somebody wrote, I think it was Hugh Sidey, and I'll leave it at that, wrote about 20th anniversary of President Kennedy's death, now that that's going to be 60 years, and that he had been with him when he was writing his inaugural, and Kennedy handed it to him. So he wasn't hearing it, he was just reading it. He went, this is nice, and Kennedy just went, yeah, okay, fine. And he said 3 days later, standing behind him, I heard what he was doing. He wasn't just speaking to the crowd there. He wasn't just speaking to the TV audience. He was talking to John Adams, Sidey said. He was talking to Jefferson and Lincoln and was trying to tell them our American Revolution still continues. And I think that's very true. And a lot of that's to your team and your doing. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
Now, you want to hear another story about him and David McCullough? So, the retired CEO at the Seaport Museum, John Brady, and Scott hadn't met. And Alex and I are thinking, well, we can put something together for this. And so we all had lunch. So when we sooner sat down, and you know, people pulled up their cell phones and thumbing through, and I thought, well, I don't have anything to talk about, so. You know, and all of a sudden Alex was, oh God, I'm sorry, we're being rude. I said, no, everybody's working. So in the conversation I said, I don't remember if it was Jon Stewart or who it was that interviewed David McCullough some years ago, but they said, what is there left for you to accomplish? And he said, I want to die before I own a cell phone. And so John is laughing, Alex is laughing, and Scott's going like this and goes, here's his cell phone number.
True story.